We are just going to get started in a few moments. Thank you for joining us, those of you who registered and logged in early. We'll wait for a few stragglers to join, and then we will begin today's program. Thank you. Okay, let's get going. People are still coming in. I see the attendance numbers going up. If we say anything earth-shattering, lucky for you to have joined at the beginning so that you get to hear it. My name is Mitchell Davis. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of the James Beard Foundation, and it's a pleasure to welcome you today to a really interesting conversation. This is an auspicious day for us at the Beard Foundation. This morning at 10 o'clock, we released the winners of the 2020 James Beard Media Awards. Those awards include books, journalism, and broadcast media, all in some way swirling around the world of food. And because of this unusual time we find ourselves in this online announcement, we thought we would take the opportunity to have some conversations to highlight both the awards, what's gone on, what's happening, and some of the winners. So this is the first of a series called James Beard Media Awards at Home. And it's a great pleasure to be having this conversation today with the chairs of the committees who are responsible for all of those awards. I'll introduce them momentarily. Before we get into the conversation, I just want to mention that the James Beard Foundation, as you know, this is the 30th year, actually, you may not know, of the James Beard Awards, and the 33rd year of the foundation itself. Our programming, in light of the COVID pandemic and the outsized impact it has had on the restaurant community, both in the United States and really everywhere in the world, has really shifted tremendously. We still obviously are known for awards and excellence, but the events and gatherings that we are famous for at the Beard House and around the country and sometimes around the world have obviously been on hold. And instead, we have taken up the baton to do everything we can to support the restaurant industry and all of the related industries, of which the food media obviously is a strong part, but also other parts of the food chain that have been affected by this terrible, unusual, and unprecedented time. So you'll find, if you go to our website and sign up for our notifications, and if you're so inclined, would like to donate to our programs, you'll find a campaign called Open for Good, which for the next year, maybe more, is going to be focused on helping restaurants to survive this difficult moment when most of them are closed, although they're beginning to reopen, to rebuild and rebuild in a better way, one hopes, obviously, so they can sustain themselves, but also taking into account equity, inclusion, sustainability, and all the sorts of values that we hold dear at the Beard Foundation, and that we hope that restaurants and James Beard Award winners in particular, as leaders, will also aspire to, and then to thrive, which we know is the goal, and we are sure is somewhere on the horizon. So thank you for being part of that. And I'd encourage you to look at our full line of virtual programming. And in fact, let's get to today's topic. You're not here to hear me, but you're here to hear the chairs of the subcommittees of the James Beard Awards. Each award is administered by a different volunteer committee of experts who give their time and give up the opportunity, obviously, to win one of those awards while they serve. So today we'll be joined by Hsiao-Ching Chou, who's the chair of the James Beard Book Awards Committee. Those books, they're about food. They're not just cookbooks, though. Lots of books are written about food that are not cookbooks. And that's the oldest part of the Beard Awards that started long before us in 1966, and we've continued that tradition now for 30 years under our auspices. John Kessler, who is the chair of the James Beard Journalism Awards. He's a writer and an author. You may have read his great reviews or his writing when he was in Atlanta. He's now in Chicago, wishing it were warmer, perhaps. Joined also by Jamila Robinson, who for the moment is sharing the responsibilities of chairing the Journalism Awards Committee. She's the chair-elect, I guess, or they're dividing those. She's also the new food editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer, and we're pleased to have you, Jamila. And finally, Ken Rubin, who is the chair of the James Beard Broadcast Awards Committee. Broadcast includes, it's not limited to platform. Right now, we are broadcasting. As I like to say, everyone's become a broadcaster thanks to Zoom and all the other video conferencing. But Ken is also the chief culinary officer of Rouxbe Online Cooking School, which is a partner in some educational projects of the James Beard Foundation. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to recede and ask a few questions. A tiny bit of housekeeping for those listening. You're all on mute. There is no, but if you would like to ask questions, there's no chat back and forth between folks, but we have over 120 people listening right now. And if you have questions, we'll be monitoring the questions bar where you can type in any questions, and we'll try to incorporate those into the conversation. We've got about another 29 minutes or 39 minutes, I guess, to go. So I'll get with it. And I just want to start by asking each of you, because you're overseeing different aspects of the awards themselves, give us a little bit of a state of the state, if you will, of book journalism and broadcast, both in the context of the award winners who were announced today and the work last year, but really where we are right now today in COVID. And why don't I start with you, Hsiao-Ching?
Oh, well, I think that now that everybody is cooking more at home, cookbooks and other recipe sources and content is more important than ever. And to the extent that any of that content can be really accessible, I think it's just an even stronger way to advocate for creating more books. I've just observed online from all my favorite cookbook stores across the country that their sales seem to be very good, or at least a lot of interest. So I'm encouraged by that, and I think the winners from this year's contest are really stellar.
Awesome. There are a few things I'd love to talk about because books take a long time to come out, longer than all the other media that we are talking about today, and I imagine people are rushing to get home cooking books. Fewer high-end chef inspiration books out there. Do you know if that's true, or?
I think it could go both ways. So you have a lot of people who maybe aren't as familiar in the kitchen, and so they want to look for the basics. But then you have people who have a lot more time on their hands at home. So maybe they want project cooking, and that's where some of the professional books might come in to play, where they have more time to labor over a 10-part recipe. So I think that there's interest in both types of cooking for sure.
Good. We will get back to that. Let's go to journalism, and John and Jamila, give us the state of the state, if you will, and also I think journalists have been really impacted because obviously it's hard to review restaurants when there aren't any open, but I think we've seen a tremendous shift. So please enlighten us about what's going on.
Well, I can get started. One thing that we're seeing across the landscape is that food journalists, we're on the front lines. We are, covering the story not only from the shift for restaurants to takeout and delivery, but also the service component of looking at the supply chain. We're looking at how communities are impacted, as well as making the shift to home cooking. We saw in the landscape that there had been fewer stories that were about home cooking. And as Hsiao-Ching was saying, you're seeing more cookbooks. And so that means that the media landscape, and so that the journalists have to start thinking about home cooking. You're seeing that with the Washington Post voraciously, and the New York Times with cooking.com, with New York Times Cooking. But we're also seeing that that even in our communities, turning to recipes, turning to community, and telling that entire story. But we are deep in it because a lot of our media companies are being impacted by this as well. But but I feel encouraged because our audiences really need even more information about food and how it imbues our lives, how it holds us together, and then also what it and telling the story of what's happening across the restaurant and the culinary industry. So we've been on the front lines, but it has been and it's been busier certainly from the beginning of the pandemic up until today.
Yeah, I would add in that it's I mean, it really is a fun time, not fun, but it's a productive time for journalists because there's so many more kinds of stories that they can write now. You know, they really are getting to understand much more about the business models of restaurants and about the staffing, about the different positions, and it's really changing the relationship a lot, particularly in terms of reviewing. I mean, you know, a lot of good people good writers around the country, like Deborah First in the Boston Globe and Carlos Frias in the Miami Herald, and the guy, I can't remember his name, but a guy at San Diego Magazine wrote a wonderful story too, just about, can you really be a restaurant critic anymore? You know, what you really are trying to do as a restaurant writer is show how this, you know, whole sort of ecosystem is keeping itself alive and what they can do to survive.
Fascinating. Meanwhile, while the industry of news is also been pretty hard hit. I mean, was suffering anyway before this, but even so, revenue, retail, all the sorts of things that keep them afloat. We'll get back. There are so many interesting things, I think, that trends that were happening that have either been exacerbated or completely sort of turned around by this situation. So I'd love to talk about some of that. But before we do, Ken, broadcast. Now, lots of changes have happened, as I was just saying, before this pandemic. What from your perspective, what do you see? What's happening now, and what do you think the impact of that's going to be sort of in the short term?
Yeah, I think in the short term, we're seeing a speeding up of people adopting new technologies to broadcast from home, people being more sort of that, you know, auto broadcast mode where they're producing their own content on their own completely. So they're not going into a studio, or they're not going on location. Even thinking about new media and broadcasting forms. So using things like Zoom to produce new types of cultural content that we can ingest and have some kind of, you know, kind of like a cultural circulation around, because it's a new way of talking, it's a new way of storytelling, it's a new way for different messages or brands to be present. And I think for many people, this kind of you know, hitting that like fast forward button in terms of technology has forced people into a position that we could have anticipated happening at some point. Like we could have anticipated Zoom being a lot more prominent in our lives in terms of how we communicate. We could anticipate people being more self-sufficient, or kind of bringing the podcast studio into their own home, sort of a thing, but it made it go a lot faster. So for me, watching the creativity that's been spawned from this has been very exciting. Seeing people who, you know, conventionally we're used to seeing in a studio setting or some sort of highly produced setting where there might have been 20 or 30 people around them. Now they're doing it on their own or with their spouse. And in talking to people who, you know, traditionally work in that studio setting, just the complexities around that are fascinating to hear people talk about navigating what it looks like to be on a shoot, or what it looks like to be in a production with, you know, potentially dozens of people in a very small space for many, many hours without those luxuries of social distancing, or with around food hand washing all the time and things like this. So it's been pretty interesting to watch it in the last few months.
So let's pick up on that theme, because as you sort of underscored, and it's something that's been on my mind, many of the trends, even in restaurants, people were starting to take out more and more food, order in, use the services, and the current situation, both perhaps a confluence of technology, of sort of the ether, and then the immediate emergency, let's say, or the complete change from COVID of the lockdowns, force people even farther ahead. And let's talk about that element in all of these fields. So you just brought up one. Let me point to the journalists, where different voices, social media had really started to change food writing that I've noticed that our awards winners have shown for a long time. I mean, debates that would never have happened on the food pages, whether it's about racial justice or whether it's about sort of the responsibility for sustainability, all the sorts of things. How have you seen the COVID situation, let's call it, impact that in journalism? Has it sped up some of those trends, or could you identify others?
Well, I would say that. Oh,
go ahead. Yeah.
Go ahead.
John can start this time.
Okay. I would say for sure. I mean, the focus of food journalism has just changed, practically overnight because of COVID. And, just looking at, I mean, the thing about food journalism is it's always been not about the food, but about how food is, opens you in, opens a discussion into, issues of social justice, of culture, of so many different things. And so the food is the way into it. And now there are all these other discourses that food is letting us into, and just seeing how, the pandemic is affecting different, different communities differently, different cities, how people, now that the reopening has started, I mean, there have just been some sort of harrowing stories coming out of, Hannah Raskin just wrote one in the Charleston Post and Courier about, just all this animus that is, customers are letting out now that they're, they don't want to wear masks and things like that. So that's become a, an important, it's a political issue, but it's a lot more than that too. So I just think that the situation has really changed the topics, and that's kind of been, it's made food journalism really, really vital to each community.
Jamila, I'm slightly I'm gonna dig a little bit deeper. You are the editor of of an esteemed, long-standing food newspaper, where I imagine for decades there would never be a political story or anything of any meat, so to speak. I'm wondering how open the paper is, and what's going on there, like from the editor's perspective.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it has changed the focus of our stories, and looking at the systems that are in place, the barriers in the food systems, not only to communities, but in talking about investment and real estate and all of these other things that are connected to the food industry. But also, I think it has given us an opportunity to really dive into different neighborhoods in Philadelphia, especially Craig LeBan, our food critic, has just written a story about tamales, which has always been a Philadelphia weekend ritual, but really understanding how tamales are helping undocumented people earn money when they can't have access to unemployment and some of the other benefits that other people have. So we've been able to really dive into some of these issues and really unpack some things that have been undercurrents: immigration, real estate, social justice, and then really seeing how food plays a huge role in some of those things. And we're seeing that across the landscape. We're seeing that in some of the essays. It's given me an opportunity to commission essays from people and to have more voices coming into our paper. But also it means that our leadership is very interested in hearing from those communities. I mean, we know that across the landscape, food journalism drives it drives subscriptions. It's an essential role for so many people. It's why we have an award, the Jonathan Gold Local Voice Award, is because our food stories are connected to communities. So being able to dive into those stories and then see how immigration and all of these other topics that are food adjacent and bringing those into the forefront has been an exciting part of the shift. And I think that will continue because people, the editors and the reporters, really understand how vital and how essential these roles are.
Hsiao-Ching, again, with the longer perspective in the book industry, it can take a year or 2 years more commonly to produce a food book. Do you think some of these trends of new stories and new voices are going to find their way into the book world too?
I certainly hope that these new voices do come into the book world. And with regard to journalism, books and kind of the daily food journalism has always had a symbiotic relationship, because we're trying to spot trends on both ends of that equation. But I think that one of the observations I've had over the course of stay at home is that there certainly have been new voices that have been surfaced due to any number of triggers, but that has been a revelation, just to be able to see who's out there, who is connected to food. Maybe they were just locally recognized, but they haven't had the opportunity to speak on a broader platform. And I'm hoping that I'm certainly taking note, to the extent that the foundation is very intentional about equity and access, et cetera. I think that we're all trying to play that role as well. So I'm taking note personally. I'm hoping that book publishers are taking note, because we see upwards of 450 entries every year, but that's not all the books that are published. And just because these books have been published doesn't mean that all the books that should be published have been published. And I'm really hoping that it's not just a marketing team somewhere deciding what should be published.
Well, if publishers and authors are listening, please say that take a risk. Now's the time. Ken, so similarly, I'm thinking before there was COVID, there was Andrew Zimmern talking food and politics on a Sunday night on my TV station. Do you see a similar openness or new openness to, let's say, heavier, more serious stories about food?
Yeah, I think for sure people are thinking a lot differently about their relationship to food. I think also that if we think about broadcast, from the production side, certainly we're seeing a lot more diverse voices speaking about a lot of different topics that we weren't really used to seeing in the last 2 years. So issues around climate change and the environment and immigration and social justice and all the things that we've kind of discussed. I think on the other side, there's a consumer base who are really demanding, who are very hungry for these stories. So it's not just driven by producers who have good ideas and who have permission to now speak about these bigger topics, but I think consumers really want this sense of connection to food as it relates to different parts of their life, and not just to the conversations that happen at the dinner table, but also connecting to all those other aspects, whether it's the comment about real estate, about kind of social systems, the way kind of the inner workings of government and who's left out, who's included, who's not, whose voices are at the table in these conversations. So I think it's really driven from both ends, and I'm really encouraged by the fact that because we have such more different openness and new voices, that new consumer groups, new groups of people who are ingesting content and kind of reacting and responding to content are becoming more a part of it. And I think that's really driving a lot of what's happening in the space, where you have younger, more diverse people demanding content that speaks to them more directly and doesn't kind of work around the edges or kind of just make a mention, but really digs in very, very deeply. So that to me is a great sign.
So given all of this, one question that comes to mind is, where's the space for just the yummy, delicious, entertaining stories of one of the people I follow on Instagram has been posting covers of original food and wine magazines, and they are both hysterical because of how they look, the photography, but also because of what they say. It just seems so hard to believe that wasn't that long ago. But where is that world of food now? And will it? I mean, we can't sustain ourselves on politics, or maybe we can. Anyone?
I think it's cross-platform. I think there's a place for it across all the different channels, whether they're from home cooks, TikTok. I mean, you can have food videos, and they're quite popular on TikTok, actually. I'm too old for TikTok, but I think that this kind of content absolutely can live across channels, and there's an audience for it in each of those.
And not only can it live across channels, but it actually democratizes, the beautiful, tasty things. Like everyone is becoming a food stylist. Everyone is becoming an in-house chef or an in-house broadcaster and starting their own shows. I follow a little baby on Instagram who is it's just the baby eating things. But the beauty of something delicious is just something that we want to continue to share, and we have to do that because taste is part of this experience. The politics is just a facet of a really large stone of our relationships with food. And so beautiful, tasty things, a wonderful Instagram, an empty plate, like think about all the baking fails, that we're actually becoming more vulnerable as we're looking for tasty things. And so I think that those trends will continue because we have all of these new platforms to share and opportunities to share.
And I was noticing that too, that on Instagram, it seems like, and on Facebook, it feels like the food's a little less stylized, a little more honest. I mean, people are, they are showing their fails. They are showing, here's my recipe for this, but oops, I burnt a batch. Let's look at that.
Everyone is showing themselves in their pajamas without a haircut in their
exactly.
Right. Do you think that's going to stick? I'm fascinated by that phenomenon, the intimacy and vulnerability, to use your word. Do we think that's going to stick around, or are we going to go the opposite? We're going to go back to those, clinking champagne glasses and tuxedos parties? Reaction.
I think this is I think if anything this horrible pandemic has brought, that is a little bit of change for the good, is that we are being, it's changing our social media personas in the way that we, the performative quality of it, and just letting people are showing who they are more.
This is the real me.
Doing your own hair and everything. So one of the questions that came in actually picks up on this line, because we are talking on this day about the James Beard Awards, the Media Award winners. It's a prestigious honor. It can be actually a career changer for nominees and winners. And yet we're kind of saying now everyone has access, everyone's a broadcaster. How do we judge, or do we have to change what we judge as excellence? And I'd love for each of you from your own perspectives to think about that. This is not new. I remember when synthesizers came out and all the musicians were going to kill themselves. But what does excellence look like in this new media world? Anyone?
Yeah,
there's always going to be. Can you go ahead?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just start by saying that I think that people can crave or can desire more than one thing. So I think that on one hand, people love seeing someone who's vulnerable, who's authentic, who made a mistake, who burnt the cookies, and you see the inside of their kitchen and you see their dog food bowl on the floor, whatever it is. But then the other side is that people still love that there was a production, that it was polished, that it was well thought through, that there was an elegance or a certain level even of production. And there's a different aesthetic to that. And I think that for me, part of the pandemic has been really kind of being okay with that and coming to terms with the fact that I could look at someone's Instagram feed and see something that I can be a spectator and feel like I'm just viewing from the outside, and I'm like the voyeur looking in going, wow, that's super special. But I could also feel like I'm there with them. I'm at the table with them, having the same conversation, shooting the breeze or whatever. And I think that's good. I think part of this is breaking down these barriers so it doesn't need to be one or the other. I think this is about multi-voices and having us kind of be who we are, which is, yeah, we're maybe lazy and zany one day and we're buttoned up and well produced that next day. So it's just kind of like a reality check, I think, in some ways.
Jamila, what were you going to add?
I'm hoping that John will talk a little bit about LA Taco and sort of the idea of excellence and how we're thinking about, how do we think about the awards differently, and how do we recognize kind of what Ken was talking about, like living in both spaces.
Right. I'm happy to. I want to quickly, Hsiao-Ching, did you have something to add too, or were you?
Oh, I just that this process is an evolution. It's always been an evolution. So we can't have a static way to approach any of this. And as the landscape changes, we have to revisit how we judge the contests, and what that means in these new formats and new approaches.
Right. So that is very true. And what Jamila was talking about was our first emerging voice winner. You know, we changed from publication of the year to emerging voice this year. It is the one award that our committee chooses. We don't send it out to the judges, but we look, and we gave it to this online publication called LA Taco, which does a great job of, you know, as I was talking before about the intersection of food and different aspects of culture, politics, social justice, and it's about much more than food too. But what we really like about it is the way that they work with young, untested journalists who are coming up out of communities and giving them these meaty assignments to write about from within their own communities. And we felt that there's such a, you get such a sense of life in LA from this publication. And it's just every possible sub-community in LA seems to, I mean, there's so many, but there's just such representation there. And there are people telling their own stories and working with good editors who are telling them, you know, how to tell their own stories and the stories of their communities. And so I think food journalism has been going there for a while. I mean, I think that the publications like Roads and Kingdom and The Bitter Southerner and these other online publications have been putting out these incredible, deeply reported pieces that have been winning a lot of awards more than legacy publications. And I think it's a good trend. I think we're getting better journalism out of it.
Amazing. I'll remind folks, we have about 12 minutes left of this conversation, and you can please ask questions. I mean, I've got plenty of questions, and we could talk for hours, all of us, and fortunately have a chance to do that once in a while. But please type your questions into the chat or the question box, and we'll try to get to them. Let's change a little bit, and let's think. I want us to imagine. You know, we're over this, and some of the, like, what would you like to stick and from this moment, and what would you like to sort of forget? We touched on it a little bit. Maybe there's a broader representation. Maybe there's the vulnerable me in pajamas and the formal me in a but when it comes to food, because one thing I should have said at the top, right? The only thing we have to consume when we're not sharing the actual food itself are the stories about the food, is the writing about the food. And I believe in my heart of hearts that those two things are intertwined. I did a graduate dissertation on it. So I'm wondering what, you know, when perhaps life is back to some other more normal seeming way, like what you'd like to hang on to and what you'd like to perhaps to let go that hasn't gone yet. Complete silence.
I nominate Hsiao-Ching.
I just want to see more types of people telling their stories, whether it's in journalism, whether it's in books or through broadcast mediums. It just, you know, there's just so many stories that aren't being told from the people who should be telling them. We just, you know, I hear this refrain all the time. It's always the same people, and we're all complicit in some way because we've come up in these legacy industries. But we have the power to change that as well. So I think that you know, now that we see and hear some of these voices, I want them to be elevated. So that's my hope.
Mm-hmm.
Just going to add on to that the thing that I want to leave behind are all the things that we need to stop doing. Being sure that our voices are not coming from on high, that it is a community-based, that we look to those communities to find ideas rather than just sitting in a room and thinking that that the arbiters of taste can be from any community, from any person of any background, and that we promote that. And we leave the idea that only certain people are able to tell those stories, that we let that go. And we have, and I want to leave this with more openness, more vulnerability, more access for more people.
Yeah, Jamila, that's I think it's a great sentiment. There's a lot of things about the past that I think we should not go back to. I mean, we all look back and have this sort of sentimentality around it in some cases, because we're like, oh, what if it went back to normal? But for a lot of us, normal wasn't great in a lot of respects. It had a lot of challenges. It had a lot of things that just seemed patently unfair or not right. And I think that if anything, we can take this opportunity, because things are in this upside down kind of like liminal state. It's neither here nor there. We're still in the process of becoming that new thing, that we have an opportunity to rethink and retool and kind of revision what that future might be. And I think part of my exercise for myself in thinking about this is really identifying those things about my past or about the history that we're kind of looking back at, that, you know, maybe we were comfortable with, or it was okay, or it was normal, but shouldn't be. So let's take it as an opportunity to kick it to the curb, and, you know, maybe even in some cases dramatically think of something new, something different. And maybe it's a time where we mark, yeah, that was like before COVID, and this is now after COVID, and we can look back at that and go, wow, that was so weird that we were holding on to that stuff. That was a bunch of junk. Why did we need a pandemic to to drop it? So,
well, it's funny because sorry,
yeah, I think we should decentralize, because a lot of the big media are located on the coast in New York, maybe a little bit in the Bay Area as well. And it's easy to reach out to the people that you know if you're based there. But we need to decentralize, and there's so much talent, so many voices that are distributed across the country and beyond. And I think if we take a note from you know, all of the Zoom calls that we've been doing for you know, our jobs, it's like you can be anywhere. So I think that's true for food.
Yeah, it's so ecumenical. I mean, there have been certain kinds of stories that have been told, and you know, when I was a restaurant critic in Atlanta, my great love was finding stories of immigrant communities and food and being able to tell those. But now I'm kind of happy to be more obsolete, as young writers are coming up and telling their own stories of their own immigrant communities. I mean, you know, that's what is exciting about eating in this country, frankly, is that there's such good food coming from so many places, and there's so many stories behind it. And, you know, I just like to see people telling their own stories now. So, you know.
it's generous of you. I mean, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, and for those of us who are gatekeepers and have the ability to open doors for people, that we are gatekeepers as opposed to kingmakers. That has been that voice on high of choosing who will be the next one or the next great thing, as opposed to putting systems in place so that we can open doors for more writers, that we create fellowship programs, or like these kind of seminars that the foundation is doing, so that we can create those access points for young writers, or for people who have been in the business for a long time and want to turn their attention to the food industry. We have the ability now, post-COVID, to try and make some of those changes.
There actually are a couple of questions about how to get into this now. I mean, it seems like everyone has an opportunity. And also, very specifically, what makes a good YouTube prep video? But like, any advice for folks who are interested in kind of going from this moment into a more professional career in food media?
Good lighting, good sound, and a good, you know, wide enough angle that you can see what's happening, and test these things. I'm sure that Ken and can speak more from the broadcast perspective, but you know, having been on the back end of a few of these, those are good sound. Like, if your video quality is kind of sketchy, if you have good sound, you're still okay. If you know, so it's like there's a hierarchy.
Yeah, I would agree. I think sound and video quality are going to be very important. Although one interesting thing I've noted with the pandemic is that, now that we're seeing major broadcasters in their homes, looking like they're on a Zoom video with not always the best light or not always the best camera, there is a sort of leveling in some ways, or there's a permissiveness in some ways around, the top specs. So while it's very important, I think people have a different idea about what it might look like in some ways. But I think the bigger piece for me around production is really finding a voice and having a perspective and a mode of operating and a mode of storytelling that's going to be really unique and, perhaps different from some of the things that you're already out there watching or kind of trying to kind of model after. So part of it is don't follow what someone else is doing, take best practices, internalize it, make it your own. But ultimately, if you're doing a demo or a video, it's going to always come down to how relatable, how relevant, how interesting that content is, regardless of the production quality. It could be the most beautiful thing, but if you're not weaving together something that people care about, they're not gonna watch it.
Fascinating. We have just a couple of minutes left, and I'd like to end by asking you, because this is about the awards. As you see the winners that came out, I'm sure you're proud. I would hope that you're proud of them all. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about them as a collective, and looking forward, if you think there might be things emerging in the community of nominees and winners that you'd encourage people to be sort of focusing on or applauding, where excellence lies, briefly.
Finding untold stories. I think we had 2 journalism winners writing about cooking for kids, and one was a self-published blog, a woman who adopted a foster child and food in that situation. Another was from the New Yorker, Burkhard Bilger, writing about the science and business behind baby food. And I'm like, oh my God, 2 brand new stories about feeding kids, I mean, Jamila and Hsiao-Ching, as newspaper food editors, how do you tackle that again? And these 2 pieces are so brilliant,
Yeah.
So that's
our book of the year is Whole Fish, and it's just taking the nose to tail approach to fish butchery, and just the way that it was presented, the way that just even the images of the fish cut up into pieces is just stunning. So I think just taking even if it's a classic approach, looking at different ingredients in those ways and treating them that way.
Jen, Jamila?
Jamila, please.
I'm always very interested in innovative storytelling and how people use the technology, the graphics, the artwork, the sound, all of these things that we have access in our fingertips, and then telling a food story through that. So looking at innovative approaches, new ways, as Hsiao-Ching was saying, a new way to approach an old story, things that are going to take you to a new place. A good innovative story will take you to an old place. And so I love seeing new publications even coming into the Beard Awards that we think of, like the Legacy, the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, being the organizations that would enter the awards. But now we're seeing self-published, we're seeing essayists and people using places like Medium to enter the award. So looking at those innovations and the evolution of storytelling and bringing that to food.
Jen, 1 minute. What's 30 seconds?
Yeah, I think just to echo what some of my partners here have already mentioned, I think creativity, innovation, storytelling are going to be very, very important. For me, in terms of broadcast, I think that I'm really fascinated by kind of new mediums, new technology. I'm very also interested in audio as a medium. I think that with all the video that we're all doing and looking at screens all day, that audio will have a new kind of primary role in our lives, because it's something that doesn't use our eyes, doesn't require us to be visual. And I think that we're going to be, if we're not already hooked in terms of audio and podcasts, very much tuned into that sort of medium, that mode of ingesting content.
Great. Well, we will be listening, looking, reading, flipping pages to find out. Before I thank you and say goodbye, I just want to remind folks that we're going to be starting, curated by you and often hosted by all of you, a series June 17th with the winners themselves. So talking about the stories they wrote, you'll be able to read or click and download their work that they won for, but also talking about them now, what they're working on, what they're finding interesting, et cetera, et cetera. There's kids, there's behind the scenes of production, all sorts of things that will help illuminate some of the trends that you've talked about and hopefully point us into new directions. So thank you for your role in helping to curate those. That's June 17th. Starting 1:30 p.m. I think, but stay tuned to the James Beard publications. Go to our website, find out about Open for Good, donate if you can, and are inspired to help us continue to cultivate this community of enlightened eaters, if you will. And thank you all for your work and your volunteers for the Beard Foundation. And it's not a small task, but also just for your insights. So thank you, chairs, for joining us today. An auspicious day.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.